It's October, so I wanted to paint up some of the most thematically relevant Legion Astartes I could think of. My personal favorite, the Thousand Suns. They're super occult and witchy and pretty scary once you start thinking about all that gold trim you have to paint. In this video, I wanted to take a look at that and some of the other corners we could cut in order to get some really great looking miniatures done in a fraction of the time. Let's check it out. I'm going to start off with a black primer and then add a 50-50 mix of Imperial Blue and Warlord Purple through my airbrush. You don't need 100% opacity, but this is going to act as the base coat and shadow layer for everything, so you want to make sure that it's pretty much everywhere that your subsequent colors won't be, such as the undersides of everything and in all the nooks and crannies. From there, I spray on some electric blue from like a 45-degree angle, making sure that plenty of that purple shadow layer is still showing through. Then I spray on some aqua green from above. I'm mostly focusing on areas like the shoulder pads, helmet, and backpack. I'm using this as the final highlight color as well as creating a focal point for the armor. Once this is applied, the main color for the armor is done. We have this really nice blue-green color. Then we have these rich purple shadows that add a lot of contrast and are going to do a lot of heavy lifting in the finished product. Once the armor color was done, I added NATO black, all of the tubing on the backpack and areas like the back of the knee and between armor joints. I made sure to not go too thick on this. I wanted the previous colors to work as an underpainting and sort of add some pre-shading and highlighting. I then went ahead and added NATO black to the weapons, but mostly focusing on the areas that were like blue or aqua and letting those purple shadows still be apparent. For all of the cloth, like the tabards and robes, I added some magenta. I built this up in layers, developing more of a richness on the raised areas to work as a highlight. Once I had decent coverage, I mixed in some Imperial Blue and float it into the recesses for shadows. I used an acrylic wash for this, and while I really like it thinned down as like a colorful wash or a glaze, I noticed as I was layering up that it kind of built up, and it wasn't that bad on the tabards, but I noticed on the robe of the aspiring sorcerer on this broader area that I was getting an unwanted texture. I did my best to scrub it off with water and then just did a wet blend of Imperial Blue and Warlord Purple. Speaking of the Aspiring Sorcerer, on mine I used some of the bits from the Exalted Sorcerer's kit to give him more of an avian look. There's that feathery arm and bird head. For that I used a thinned down version of the magenta over the blue and aqua to sort of run into the recesses and give it some coverage, blending into the purple shadows. From there, to get better coverage and to add a bit of a highlight, I then added subsequent layers of Warlord Purple. For the helms, I picked out alternating stripes on their crests and painted them in Warlord Purple. I took my time, but it still required a bit of cleanup and finesse, but I think the result's well worth it. I think only using one color for these gave a really striking result and also saved me a bit of time and headache. While I had my Warlord Purple out, I also hit all the eye lenses of the helmets. I wanted to give these sort of a glow effect, so I went in and tried to do a really thin highlight of white, but this ended up being really tricky and I messed up a lot, but I told myself as long as I get some white in the eye lens, then my plan will still work. Once the white was applied, I thinned down some Warlord Purple and ran it over the eye lenses, creating a nice glow effect. I did this same technique to the eye on the palm of the Aspiring Sorcerer's hand, and then gave it a final dot of white as an extreme highlight. Before moving on, I also took my Warlord Purple and added it as sort of an overflow of all the runes on the guns. This is important because I want to give them a glowing effect also, but I'm going to wait until all the metallic trim is done. A final detail I had to pick out was the scroll on his waist. This is something where if you're going for extreme speed, you could just leave off during the assembly phase, but I thought it was pretty cool and I wanted to add it. I first took some charred brown and added a nice base coat everywhere that, again, the blue and aqua was, leaving all the nice purple shadows. Once I had some coverage, I added in white to it in order to get more of a parchment color and began painting the details. Once I had the parchment color placed, in order to make it a little crisper and sharper, I took some of the original charred brown color, watered it down, and flowed it into the rolled up section of the scroll and into some of the other deeper shadows. Once this was in there, I then picked out some of the more pronounced areas with even more white mixed into my parchment color to create some nice highlights. During this process, I realized that the white I was using was too thin in nature. It was an airbrush paint, and when I tried to apply it, it was flowing around too much. So in order to gain better control, I took out my heavy body white, and that gave me the control I needed to pick out some of these really fine highlights. For the metallics, we're first going to dry brush on some polished gold. We're going to focus on the sculptural details such as the ornamentation of the shoulder pads, the crest, the guns, and also most of the backpacks. We're pretty much going to be painting everything that's going to be metallic besides for the areas that are strictly trim. This is going to help pick out all those details while skipping the huge time investment that comes with using your typical paintbrush. This also helps some of those base colors shine through, giving it a really cool polished gold look. And once our dry brushing is done, we can then take out what is probably the biggest painting hack of this whole thing, our gold Sharpie marker. This is a little nerve-wracking at first because you're painting something so fine with such a broad instrument, but once you get a hang of it, it's actually super fun and saves you a ton of time instead of being really finicky over all that trim. So what we're gonna do is pick out all the sharp edges of everything we just dry brushed, such as the trim on the shoulder pads, the backpack, the vents there, and then the crest on the helm. Applying as little pressure as you can, you wanna just graze the surface of the trim, laying down the gold ink. Focus on covering the areas that are electric blue or aqua green, leaving the purple parts enshrouded in shadow. This will give your gold trim a touch of realism without that much extra effort applied. Instead, you're actually doing less but giving a much bigger result because of it. And this same principle is applied to things like the backpack and shoulder pads. Focusing on the trim there and only covering what is already highlighted by the original armor base coat. Now that the gold was taken care of, I wanted to work on those glowing runes on the guns. In order to get the paint more easily into those tiny little details, I first flowed some water into them, wiped away the extra, and then just took a tiny amount on my brush and applied it. With the help of the water, I was able to quickly flow in some white into all the rune detailing and save myself a bunch of time. Once the white was dried, I did the same thing with a bit of thinned down Warlord purple to give it that glowy effect. And while I had those colors out on my palette, I mixed a little white into the Warlord purple and picked out some of the details on the cloth on the Aspiring Sorcerer. If you wanted to take everyone a step further, you could do this to all of their tabards, but I wanted to focus on the group leader and save myself some time on the other dudes. And to give him some final details, I took some Gene Stealer purple and picked out some highlights along his feathery arm and highlighted the feathers on his head. I also took some Warlord purple and added it to some of the flames on the burning icon, but you could also just leave it gold. For the basing, because there was already all this colorful overbrush on their base, I just used some thinned down NATO black to cover it. This allowed some of the color to shine through, and it gave me a cool look without doing the typical base paint, wash, dry brush type thing. And for the victory lap on these dudes, instead of painting the base trim, I instead used rubbing alcohol to just get all of the not black stuff off the black plastic. And as the final touch, I added some static grass around each of their feet. Ever since I got these guys, I kind of envisioned foliage springing out of each one of their footsteps as if they were creating change with every single step they took. And with that, these guys are finished. I'm super stoked about the final result, and it was really fun to see a plan come together. I went into this knowing what I wanted to do, but wasn't completely sold on everything until I got all that gold on there. I feel like that really tied the whole model together, and all of the purple shadows give the entire paint job a lot of harmony. By heavily leaning into the high contrast base coat and then picking out a lot of the gold details with Sharpie and special effects like glowing runes, I think you get a really awesome result with not a ton of time spent. I think they look even better in real life and look awesome on the tabletop. I love the Thousand Suns, and Magnus is my favorite character in Warhammer 40k, so it feels awesome to finally get some paint on these guys. And it was also nice to take a break from my larger painting projects like my dedicated armies and focus on some dudes that I really just like the look of them and their lore. The other cool thing about this is that you can chunk through something like a squad of Rubric Marines or a kill team, and then give yourself a lot more time to focus on the cool things like Magnus or your exalted sorcerers and really give them a lot more of your love and care. Well, you can speed paint these dudes and they still look awesome. I hope this gives you something to think about when approaching your next painting project, especially if it's riddled with gold trim like these guys. It's always fun to incorporate something new, and even if it seems a little weird, I think it's worth experimenting with to see the fun results you can get. Thanks so much for watching the video. I really appreciate you taking the time to do so. If you enjoyed it, consider subscribing, but overall, thanks for sticking around to the end and checking out the results with me. Thanks.